I'm curious, Glenn. Like, this is something I've always wanted to ask you. A lot of us came to know about you because of your coverage of Edward Snowden. And I'm curious, during that time when you were covering that story, at any point were you ever afraid? And I asked this question because not too long ago, Blumenthal was on here, and he was explaining to me how sometimes those of them at the gray zone, because of the coverage that they do, sometimes they get intimidation, sometimes they may get death threats. And I'm curious, and that reminded me of when you covered Edward Snowden, and I thought about that. I was like, wow, I wonder, was Glenn Greenwald ever afraid, like during that time?
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of times when things were very, very tense. For those of you who haven't seen the documentary about the work we did with Edward Snowden that won the Academy Award in 2015 for Best Documentary, Citizen Four, it captures this very kind of intense atmosphere that prevailed the entire time when he and I, along with Laura Poitras, who directed that film, we were working in this very small hotel room in Hong Kong. But even before that, when I got contacted by him and he told me he was in Hong Kong and I made him prove he actually had documents that were worth going across the globe in order to meet with him, in order to see. And when he sent me the first tiny, sample of like maybe 2 dozen documents, already I knew this is going to be the most sensitive leak by far in the history of the national security state, even more than the Pentagon Papers, because I had in my hand these unbelievably explosive documents, the first time top secret documents had leaked from the NSA. And from that point forward, we never knew who knew what we were up to. I live in Brazil. It's a place notorious for a heavy CIA presence. When I went to Hong Kong, we were always very alarmed because we didn't know. We were in Hong Kong, which is already this very kind of surreal place to be in. It's literally on the other side of the world. When it's day here, it's night there. It's kind of China, but not China. We didn't know if Chinese authorities knew what we were doing, if Hong Kong authorities knew what we were doing, if American authorities had traced Edward Snowden, discovered what he was doing. And so the entire time I was, honestly waiting for the door to be kicked down at any moment inside that hotel room. And then when I was ready to leave Hong Kong after we did the first couple of week stories, my intention was to fly back to the United States on my way back to Brazil to do press conferences, do media. And my lawyer said, we're being threatened by the Justice Department that if you try and enter the United States, there's a good chance you'll be subpoenaed, if not arrested. We advise you to instead go directly back to Brazil and stay there until we tell you it's safe. I flew back to Brazil. The whole time I had a backpack filled of thumb drives, encrypted thumb drives of the most sensitive secrets of the world's most powerful governments on my person at all times. And the United States government was being threatening publicly and privately that if I were to leave Brazil, there was a chance they would arrest us. And I stayed in Brazil for almost a full year. We constantly had cars out front in our house, which was pretty isolated in Rio. We kind of lived in the woods. There were clearly people monitoring what we were doing. Yeah, it was a very high tension time. It wasn't quite as dangerous, I would say, as the Brazil reporting we did, where I actually ended up being indicted and we had very serious death threats. But that year and a half of our lives was definitely extremely, difficult. I mean, it was filled with threats of that kind all the time. It was like international, like a thriller film, but it was our lives.
Do you ever think he'll be allowed to come back to the US?
Whether I will be?
Mhm.
Well, I've come back to the U.S. Many times since What happened was I waited until basically the week of the Pulitzers were being announced, and it was widely assumed we were going to win a Pulitzer. And it was already announced that we had won a Polk Award, which is kind of the second most prestigious award for investigative journalists. And that week, there was a big event where every journalist was in a room waiting. There was tons of press at the airport. I first flew to Berlin to meet with Laura Poitras, and she hadn't left Germany. She did all the work in Germany on the film and on the reporting. And she and I flew back together to the U.S. We landed at Kennedy Airport in New York, and we had no idea what was going to happen if we were going to be let into the country. But we gambled that the PR cost of arresting us when we were basically coming to accept Pulitzers and Polks and all the awards that the Western world has to offer journalists, the imagery of arresting us while we were coming to get those awards would be too costly for the United States. Then we were able to enter the country without being arrested. And ever since then, I felt more or less free to come and go as I please. And I'm in the US quite a bit now.